900 strikes, a single morning, Iran burns. The strait goes dark, 97% of shipping gone. The largest American military operation since Iraq begins. The kill chain. Today, we enter the battlefield of Operation Epic Fury and the conflict that shattered strategic certainty. For decades, American strategists treated Iran as a problem to be contained, rather than fought. That assumption rested on a calculation that Tehran would never risk annihilation by provoking Washington. By January of 26, the calculus shifted as Iran's uranium stockpile approached 10 nuclear devices. The International Atomic Energy Agency had lost all access to Iran's declared enrichment facilities entirely. What awaited both nations would rewrite modern warfare doctrine, but that February morning plan seemed flawless. The American military buildup preceding the strike was the largest Middle Eastern deployment since Iraq in 2003. 50,000 American personnel were already positioned across 10 countries, forming a ring around Iranian territory. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar alone, over 10,000 personnel supported the coming air campaign. The strategic logic seemed deceptively simple. Overwhelming force, delivered simultaneously, would paralyze Iran's ability to retaliate. Destroy the missile batteries first, then eliminate nuclear sites, and kill the leadership before orders reach units. It was the doctrine of decapitation, swift and surgical, and predicated on intelligence that left zero margin. Iran, however, had spent 4 decades preparing for precisely this ambush scenario, with preparations that defied convention. Beneath the Zagros Mountains, the Revolutionary Guard constructed a network of hardened tunnels stretching for hundreds of kilometers. 3,000 ballistic missiles were dispersed across these subterranean complexes, mobile and designed to survive first strikes. Iran's defense budget was barely $7 billion, yet asymmetric warfare does not require parity with adversaries. It requires patience and dispersal, and the willingness to absorb punishment no Western democracy would ever tolerate. The man who embodied that doctrine was Supreme Leader Khamenei. Architect of Iran's 4 decades of defiance, his strategic philosophy was forged during the Iran-Iraq War. 8 years of attritional slaughter costing 1 million lives. From that catastrophe, he drew one lesson. Iran must never again depend on foreign powers for survival. That meant indigenous missiles and drones and air defenses plus a network of proxies striking from every direction. On the American side, months of classified intelligence assessments and deteriorating diplomatic options drove the decision to strike. The IAEA's May 25 report was unequivocal. Iran possessed near-weapons-grade uranium sufficient for 10 nuclear devices. Earlier strikes in June 25 had targeted enrichment facilities, but intelligence suggested they delayed the program by months. The fog of war surrounding Iran's true nuclear status made the decision both necessary and terrifyingly uncertain. On the 28th of February at 0710 local time, a tomahawk erupted from the USS Spruance. The booster fell away, and the turbofan engine spooled to life, dropping the missile 50 feet above water. 4 seconds later, the next cell fired, then another. until hundreds of Tomahawks were airborne across the Gulf. Simultaneously, Israeli stealth fighters crossed into Iranian airspace from the northwest, mapping every active radar emitter below them. The coordinated assault struck from multiple axes, sea-launched cruise missiles from the Gulf and ordnance. From the west, the first wave targeted Iran's integrated air defense network, the radars and command nodes holding everything together. Without those radars, Iranian missile batteries became blind, unable to track incoming threats or coordinate any defensive response. This was not reconnaissance by fire, but the systematic dismantlement of an entire nation's defensive architecture at dawn. On the ground in Tehran, the first indication came from trembling windows in residential blocks kilometers from targets. Inside the IRGC's underground bunkers, the scale became apparent. As base after base reported catastrophic damage to command, among the earliest targets was the leadership compound. In Tehran itself, the strike that killed Khamenei before noon, the decapitation of Iran's supreme command, created an immediate crisis of authority, but it did not create paralysis. The IRGC had rehearsed this contingency for years, and decentralized command protocols activated automatically across every single theater. Within hours, the retaliation began, and its scale stunned American planners, who had expected a wounded, not prepared adversary. Iranian missiles struck American bases across the region in Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, and Iraq simultaneously. American casualties mounted quickly, 14 dead and 200 wounded in the opening exchanges alone that first week. The war of attrition that every American planner had sought to avoid had begun within the first 72 hours, but the missiles were only the opening act of a far more devastating an innovative Iranian counter-strategy unfolding. Iran launched over 1,400 drone strikes within 72 hours of the first American bombs falling on Iranian soil. Each drone cost a fraction of the interceptor missile required to destroy it, a devastating arithmetic of attrition. A single Patriot interceptor cost roughly $3 million, while an Iranian Shahid drone cost perhaps $50,000. An analyst later framed the dilemma bluntly: the winning defense would be one that killed targets cheaply overhead. Premium interceptors were being burned at unsustainable rates against targets engineered to exhaust precisely those expensive defensive stockpiles. While drone swarms tested American air defenses, Iran's naval forces moved to execute a strategy with global consequences. The encirclement of the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide, would strangle 20% of global oil supply. Anti-ship missile batteries hidden along Iran's southern coastline turned those narrow waters into a killing ground for any vessel. Maritime traffic through the strait collapsed almost immediately, and the 97% drop was not gradual but a cliff. Tanker crews who had navigated these waters for decades now refused to sail through the contested strait at all. Insurance premiums alone exceeded the value of the cargo, making every voyage a financial impossibility before the military risk. Global oil prices surged within Hours as the economic shockwave, radiating from those 21 miles, reached every nation on Earth. The American Navy reinforced with 3 warships and Marines, but holding a strait against a hostile coastline. Is different warfare. Every radar contact on those bridge screens could be a fishing vessel or an explosive-laden fast boat approaching at speed. The fog of war extended to every single blip on every screen aboard every American warship in those narrows. Back in Washington, the cost of Operation Epic Fury was itself becoming a devastating strategic crisis, $900 million daily. By day 6, cumulative expenditure reached $11 billion, and by day 12, it had hit $16.5 billion. While Washington counted dollars, Tehran counted something more consequential: the political resolve of an adversary fighting thousands of miles away. Iran's entire strategic doctrine rested on one premise: that America would exhaust its willingness to sustain distant casualties. It was the lesson of Vietnam and Afghanistan, where superior firepower met inferior patience and consistently lost. The appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei, the dead supreme leader's son, signaled the regime's hardline posture would not soften. Not a government collapsing, but a dynasty hardening. The deception had failed in its most critical strategic objective. Across the region, Iran's network of proxies activated with coordinated precision. A second front Americans anticipated but could not prevent. The flanking threat from multiple directions forced American assets to disperse, precisely opposite the concentrated force doctrine commanders required. In the cyber domain, the war assumed an invisible dimension, as both nations unleashed capabilities held in reserve for decades. Federal authorities inside America issued warnings of potential Iranian cyber attacks, targeting civilian power grids and financial communications networks directly. The battlefield had expanded far beyond anything original strike planners envisioned. From the Persian Gulf to American cyberspace, on the ground in Iran, the human cost mounted with terrible speed. 1,200 killed in the first week. Among the dead were approximately 200 women and 200 children, a toll transforming international opinion immediately. Israeli airstrikes killed between 4,000 and 5,000 Iranian military personnel in strikes targeting Revolutionary Guard command infrastructure directly. Western intelligence assessed 80% of Iran's total offensive capability had been destroyed. By any conventional measure, this was decisive. But conventional measures had already proven inadequate because the remaining 20% continued to fight with completely undiminished fury. For American destroyer crews patrolling the strait, the war had collapsed into a grinding routine of perpetual unbroken vigilance. Every watch brought the same agonizing calculation: engage a contact that might be hostile and risk killing civilians, or hesitate for just seconds too long and risk losing the ship and every sailor aboard to an ambush. This was the fog of war made operational, life and death ambiguity, compressed into seconds aboard steel warships. In hostile waters, Chatham House described the moment with clinical precision. For Tehran, this conflict was existential and clearly about regime survival. It was unlikely to end quickly, and every additional day pushed both nations deeper into attrition favoring the defender. The precedent of the 1953 coup haunted every calculation. Iranians rally behind government when sovereignty is threatened. An analyst offered the most damning assessment. This was not a necessary response to an imminent nuclear threat. It was a discretionary escalation. Where Iran's nuclear program supplied the most persuasive justification for regime change operations, the president himself had framed the assault as opportunity for the Iranian people to take back their government. But Iran was not Iraq with 88 million people and mountainous terrain, and a military that had not been hollowed. Iran could mobilize over 1 million personnel, regular army and guard and reservists, defending homeland, not fighting abroad. On the 12th day, Iranian forces executed a coordinated drone saturation attack, unlike anything modern air defenses were designed for. Wave after wave launched from dispersed sites across Iran's vast interior that no satellite reconnaissance had ever successfully identified. The Pentagon's targeting algorithms had mapped every known military facility, but Iran's drone program was embedded within civilian infrastructure. The deception was elegant. Strike the factories and destroy civilian livelihoods before cameras, or spare them while drones continue. Drone production relied on commercial supply chains, small motors and simple guidance and fiberglass bodies available in every single market. Operational doctrine had evolved beyond anything conventional militaries rehearsed, prioritizing sheer volume over precision and attrition over accuracy entirely. Each interceptor fired was a $3 million commitment against a $50,000 target, and the mathematics of decimation worked only one way. American commanders faced a tactical retreat from positions they could not hold, defeated not by fire but by economics. The nuclear question, the ostensible trigger for the entire operation, remained terrifyingly and completely unresolved. As fighting continued, the IAEA had no access to enrichment facilities, and no inspector could verify whether the uranium stockpile survived or dispersed. The war designed to prevent a nuclear Iran may have created conditions under which a desperate regime accelerates in secret. The strategic paradox was complete. The strike intended to eliminate a threat had instead made that threat entirely incalculable. The cost by day 12 had reached $16 billion, roughly Iran's entire annual defense budget. Spent in a fortnight, every dollar spent prosecuting the air campaign was a dollar unavailable for reconstruction that any political settlement would eventually require. The war was fought with 21st century weapons against a 21st century adversary using strategic assumptions borrowed from the previous century entirely. The assumption that technological superiority could substitute for political strategy, that shock could compel proud nations, had failed before. In Baghdad and Kabul and Saigon, the pattern was always consistent, and the lesson had never once been absorbed. Iran endured not because its military matched America's, but because its strategic patience exceeded America's. Strategic attention span entirely. The aura of American invincibility, maintained since the Gulf War, had been punctured by an adversary spending 1%. The last stand of conventional strategic thinking occurred, not in Iran's mountains but inside the briefing rooms of Washington. Operation Epic Fury achieved every tactical objective, destroying 80% of Iran's offensive capability in just 12 violent days. It killed the supreme leader and degraded the nuclear program and demonstrated force projection on a scale not seen in decades, and none of it produced the political outcome that justified the operation's existence or the billions spent pursuing it. The regime survived and the nuclear question deepened, and the Strait remained contested as attrition continued to bleed both nations. Over 1,200 Iranian civilians dead alongside 14 American service members who would never return home to their families. The cold truth is that military success and strategic success proved to be entirely and irreconcilably different things in practice. It is a distinction that has determined the outcome of every major conflict since Vietnam at extraordinary continuing cost. This war is not over, and its consequences will shape the Middle East and global economy for decades to come. Tell us in the comments, was this operation a strategic necessity or the costliest miscalculation of our century so far? Subscribe and join us as we continue examining the operations that defined and destroyed the certainties of our age.